All right, so let's start by discussing the process of defining the term communication. As you saw before, there's a lot of different meanings and senses for the word communication. So if you were somebody who was studying communication, you'd probably want to be pretty clear about what it is that you're looking at. And so you're going to want to come up with a definition that clearly defines what's the proper object that you're examining and studying. And that's exactly what communication scholars did, especially in the 20th century. As they were beginning to do their work in U.S. universities, they came up with different definitions of what it is that they were studying. And in 1970, this guy over here, Frank Dance, wrote an essay called The Concept of Communication. And in it, what he did was he examined many of the definitions that were used by communication scholars in the decades before him, and he kind of mapped those definitions out and compared and contrasted them and found that they had certain key differences. And he defines those differences as issues. When crafting a definition for communication, there are certain issues that communication scholars had to consider. And those issues are as follows. The first issue that you'll need to consider is, how broad of a concept, how much breadth do we want in our definition? Meaning, what are we going to consider to be communication, and what are we going to consider to not be communication? What are the types of activities that would count as communication, and what wouldn't count as communication? Related to this idea of breadth is the idea of intentionality, because whether or not you require intentionality could affect how broad the definition is. So the role of intentionality in communication deals with whether or not the participants in the act of communication need to be intentionally sending and receiving the messages. So a broad definition might not include intentionality. A more narrow definition would require some sort of higher consciousness involved in the participants. Another issue is whether or not the definition that you've crafted emphasizes the activity of sending or the activity of receiving, or does it kind of talk about both activities in the definition? If your definition is sender-based, it's going to be about crafting a message and transmitting it. If it's receiver-based, it's going to be about kind of making sense out of the messages or the stimulus or whatever it is that's coming from the environment. And then some messages are going to talk about the exchange, the back and forth, the interaction between sender and receiver. A final issue that communication scholars considered was the issue of symbol use. Is symbol use required in your definition of what is communication? A symbol use, right, is the use of one thing to stand in for another. For example, there's the sound system, right, and the sound dog stands in for the idea of a dog out there in the world. And so that's a pretty complex activity, and a lot of scholars argue that symbol usage is something that sets humans apart from other species of living things. And so if your definition includes symbols, it's likely because you're focused in on the activity of humans in your study. So how you define communication affects what you're going to end up looking at when you engage in the study of communication. Let's take a look at some of the definitions that were used by researchers throughout the years. Communication is the discriminatory response of an organism to stimulus. So here we're talking about discriminatory response, the ability to discriminate between stimulus and only responding to certain stimulus. So this is pretty broad, right? It includes the activity of any organism that's able to respond to certain stimulus. Okay. Intentionality is not required. It's a bit sender and receiver based. It's about the response is the first thing they say, which is the sending, but to a stimulus. So there's the suggestion of receiving as well. And symbols aren't required. It could be any type of response, not just a symbolic response in this definition. So this is pretty broad, and it's way broader than the definition that we're typically using in this class when we're using the word communication. Communication, here's the next one, is the transmission of information, ideas, emotions, skills, etc., by the use of symbols, words, pictures, figures, graphs, etc. Here we're talking about the transmission, which to me is emphasizing the kind of sending of the symbols. Because it's symbols and because we're talking about the transmission, we likely would think that these are intentional transmissions, that the transmissions are intentional. It's saying explicitly that it needs to be symbolic transmission. And yeah, it's pretty sender-based here in this definition. So that would limit what you're looking at. You're looking at probably like how somebody crafts a speech or the crafting of an advertisement or a commercial or some sort of mediated message. Here's another definition, going back to the really broad definition. Interaction, even on a biological level, is a kind of communication. So any type of interaction between two things could be biological systems, the interaction between your stomach and the rest of your digestive system, right? Could be a type of communication. Again, pretty broad and much broader than the kind of definition that we'll be using as we begin our study of communication. Communication is a process whereby people assign meanings to stimuli in order to make sense out of the world. Okay, so we're saying that communication is a process whereby we assign meanings to stimuli. So this is receiver-based. It's got the idea of meaning, which to me is intentional, and it involves consciousness with meaning, and you're saying people here in particular. So we've limited the breadth of our definition there, but we are primarily here receiver-based. Okay. None of these are the definition that I want you to know and memorize. That's coming in the next slide, and we'll also feature a definition that I'll ask you about in the quiz. Here are definitions that I think are a little bit closer to what I mean and what the textbook means when we're talking about communication. This comes from the textbook, and it will be in an upcoming quiz. The process of using symbols to exchange meaning. So it's a process, it's something that's ongoing over time. It's the use of symbols to exchange meaning. And so it's suggesting that this is a human activity of sending and receiving symbols in this case. That's a good definition and encompasses a lot that we'll be talking about this semester. So I do want you to know that definition. I'm going to throw out another one just because why not have multiple definitions. It's good for us to have a lot of different ways of thinking about and talking about communication. This one's similar to the last one and is one that's generally what I mean when I'm talking about communication. The process of making sense out of the world and sharing that sense with others through verbal and nonverbal messages. Again, it's this process of making sense and sharing that sense. So we're getting some of that exchange and conversation here. And this one is saying not just symbolic verbal communication, but also nonverbal communication. So slightly broader, I think, than the Stokes-Rice definition. go ahead and know both of these ways of thinking about communication, as that's really the ballpark of what I'm talking about, and definitely what the textbook's talking about when we talk about communication. In the next video, we're going to turn to different ways of looking at communication, or visually representing communication in models of communication. Great. That was a good take.